We are honored to have Reverend Dr. William Barber with us today. In these past few fraught years, the Reverend has become an indispensable figure in the civil rights landscape, the architect of a broad-based political and moral movement countering the divisiveness of Trumpism. I had the great fortune to be at Riverside Church in New York in April 2017 when Reverend Barber delivered his sermon, quote, "When silence is not an option." It was 50 years to the day the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his 1967 speech against the Vietnam War, calling for a radical revolution of values, declaring his opposition to the intertwined evils of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. Many will remember the fierce disapproval King confronted. His allies in the civil rights movement and the liberal community attacked him. 150 newspapers wrote editorials denouncing him. The New York Times rebuked him, arguing, quote, "to divert the energies of the civil rights movement to the Vietnam issue is both wasteful and self-defeating." The Nation instead wrote that King, who had been the magazine's civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 67, it wrote that his Riverside Church speech will rank as one of the most significant of his career, morally uncompromising, laced with eloquence. Reverend Barber is very much his own person, but like King, he understands that the prophetic role of the preacher or religious leader is to challenge the soul and heart of the nation. Reverend Barber understands that the moral and constitutional crisis we face in America today is not just about Republicans versus Democrats or liberals versus conservative. It is instead about right versus wrong. We are in a struggle for the heart and soul of the nation. And in a real sense, we face the question of whether America can be. For half a century, Reverend Barber knows as political operatives who will pave the way for Trumpism have used Richard Nixon's and Ronald Reagan's Southern strategy to pit Black, brown, and white people against one another. They have hijacked our moral narrative to frame narrow cultural differences as the only moral issues in public. And they have tried to paint the resistance to their consolidation of power as anti-American. Reverend Barber's work has refused to allow today's know-nothings to hijack America's narrative. He's done so wearing many hats, cloths, duties. As pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, since 1993 as a former president of the North Carolina NAACP, as the founder of Moral Mondays, an extraordinary fusion coalition, first organized in 2013 to protest the conservative agenda of North Carolina state legislature. Moral Mondays is credited with salvaging voting rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, healthcare, and largely credited with helping Roy Cooper narrowly defeat right-wing Pat McCrory in 2016 in the governor's race. Reverend Barber is president of Repairers of the Breach, which seeks to reclaim the idea of a true morality for progressive activism, and co-chair of the relaunched Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, Martin Luther King Jr.'s last and most radical campaign. And as head of that, Reverend Barber, along with Liz Theo Harris and others, has engaged in acts of nonviolent moral civil disobedience. They convened an extraordinary call in June as they challenge poverty, systemic racism, the racializing of voter suppression, and the cruelty of our immigration system and impoverished democracy. Reverend Barber is a key architect of a third Reconstruction, as well as the co-author of the third Reconstruction, How Our Moral Movement is Overcoming the Politics of Fear and Division. The Reverend files scores of dispatches from the front lines of the racial justice movement. Many, we are grateful, for the Nation, where he is our civil rights correspondent. And in 2015, the Reverend received the Puffin Nation Prize for Creative Citizenship. The same year, he was a featured speaker at the nation's 150th anniversary celebration, along with Senator Warren. I cannot think of anyone I would rather hear from at this time. Welcome, Reverend Barber. We're grateful you are with us today.
Thank you so much, my dearest sister, Katrina, and to all of the Nation's family, and to all of those who read and learn and grow from the experience of the many, many years the Nation has been helping to shape consciousness. I'm honored to be here this morning. You know, when I think about this movement we're in, this moment we're in, we know what we believe. No matter how many lies we've heard, we know that love, justice, fundamental fairness, truth, are more important than lies and greed and meanness. We know what we believe. We know that together we must decide that we will never surrender to the necropolitics, the politics of death that is embedded in far too much of our public policy. We know who we're supposed to be from a faith perspective. All are made human in the image of the Creator. And we're supposed to care about our brothers and sisters, treat our neighbors right. We're supposed to be people who know some things are self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that our own founding documents say that when we move away from that, the people have a right to alter and change the government. We know that the constitutional mandate for our nation is supposed to be to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, and to promote the general welfare of every citizen. As we say in the movement, everybody in, nobody out. And we know based on that rendering that establishing justice precedes ensuring domestic tranquility, that there is indeed no way to have peace and tranquility without established justice. And once established, we continue to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare of all people. I know as a person who walks in the Christian faith that nations will be judged not by its gross domestic product, but according to the founder of the faith I follow, how it treats the least of these, the immigrant, the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, and the imprisoned. And that these values say nothing about left versus right, and certainly nothing about center or being centrist on these matters. I don't know what really being a centrist is. I can't find anywhere in the Bible or in the Constitution or Declaration of Independence that says we should only establish half of justice for half the people. That would be the center. Or half protecting the common defense. No, it says establish justice for all. I don't know anywhere in the Constitution where it says that we should provide equal protection under the law for half. Just a half. That's what to operate in the center seems to mean. The truth is, the only center that we should really be caring about in our work to shape public policy is what's at the center of people's lives, what's hurting them, the misery index, the trouble that people are facing, the problems the mourning that being caused by hurt. And so we are in now the center of a virus that has been allowed to spread and kill in ways that it never had to. Been allowed to have, in a sense, a grotesque feeding frenzy on the people of this nation and around the world. And it's taken place in a society that was already deeply unequal before the pandemic. 140 million people were poor or one emergency away from being poor, including approximately 60% of Black people and over 60%, 4% of Hispanic people and 60% of indigenous people and 40% of Asian people and 33% of white people, which is actually 66 million people, 40 million more than the number of Black people in poverty and low wealth from raw numbers. The pandemic incessantly spread and deepened along the fissures of inequality, racial disparities, and the disparities caused by poverty, and the inadequate policies that existed prior to the pandemic. Just in the last few months, 8 million people were pushed below the poverty line. In March and April of 2020, 21.5 million workers lost their jobs. 12.7 million lost their health insurance because we still have this unjust way of providing health care that is connected to people's jobs rather than their humanity and their bodies. In October, a report just came out from the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity that more than 1 in 4 workers were either unemployed or working for poverty level. And the report says that the normal government statistics hide the real pain so that the unemployment and the underemployment aren't even visible. That means we have adults who are earning below $20,000 a year or below the poverty line. And the economic shock of COVID-19 is greater than 2008 and 2009 Great Recession, and even in some measurements, the Great Depression. Workers were facing extreme economic distress and insecurity before COVID. And it made them more vulnerable to the pandemic's economic fallout because our politics had not addressed the issues of poverty and low wealth. Before COVID, far too many people were not paid enough to build up savings. They lacked paid sick leave and medical leave and health insurance. They lacked unemployment insurance and affordable options for high quality childcare. Far too many lacked the power and the voice and the labor and union rights to demand safe working conditions. The truth is, all recessions are hard on low-wage workers, but most recessions, according to a report we just did with the Economic Policy Institute, do not start in low-wage sectors. Traditionally, they start in manufacturing or construction, and then they radiate outward. But this time, because of COVID, the economic sectors requiring face-to-face interactions in the U.S. economy are disproportionately staffed by low-wage workers, which means then that Black people and brown people and indigenous people and poor, low-wealth white people are the epicenter of the COVID-19 shock, the very people we now call essential to our movement as a society. Many of them now feel extinguishable, even though they got a name change from service workers to essential workers. As I have moved among them and talked to them, they feel like they are being extinguished. And so we've had an inept national response to this from the White House all the way through the Republican Senate. And I believe, along with many, that we are seeing crimes against nature. We see, for instance, a narcissistic president, current president, and a Senate leader and their minions who are more concerned about changing legal and legitimate vote counts than protecting people from lying in caskets. So what needs to be done? We must, after post-election, address this issue with visionary social and economic policy, because the health and the well-being of the nation is at stake. What we need is long-term economic policy that rejects decades of austerity and builds strong social programs that lift society above below. The CARES Act was not enough because 84% of the money went to banks and corporations. And truth of the matter is, it would take more than one-shot policy activism to bring us out of these depths. I was reading just the other day that in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first 100 days, he passed over 70 pieces of legislation to help move the country out of the Great Depression. Truth is, most of what is needed in this COVID-19 driven recession is the same thing that is needed in every recession. Right now, we must fight for the enactment of comprehensive and just COVID relief. This means ensuring equitable and free access to COVID testing, treatment, and vaccines free, regardless of documentation status, ability, race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, age, or income. Expanded unemployment insurance to cover all workers, paid sick leave and family leave, moratoriums, and in some places, forgiveness on utilities, shutoffs, and rent and mortgage payments, student debt relief, and guaranteed monthly payments to alleviate the economic fallout from the pandemic. Right now, if we had the vision, corporations and government could strike a deal to pay portions of people's salary and allow people to go home so that the society could step out of the COVID as a way to giving us a chance to recover from it. Number two, we must raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour immediately, not 5 years from now, 20 years from now. We must guarantee health care for all, regardless of any pre-existing conditions. Yes, expand Medicaid expansion, but we must have health care for all. How can we not in the middle of COVID? And how can we not push for it when every senator and congressperson gets a public option, free health care paid for by us? Best of health care, best pensions. How can we settle for anything less and not fight and say how immoral it is for them to have it and not want their constituents to have it? We must guarantee quality housing for all and expand public and affordable housing and widow assistance. We must guarantee safe, quality, and equitable public education, increasing public education funding at all levels. We need additional resources for public schools to provide online and remove learning and learning to all students, social programs and services to poor families, increase support for students with disabilities and ESL programs, teachers, administration, infrastructure, technology support, and upgrades. We must build up investments, infrastructure, climate resilience, and energy efficiency of poor and low-income communities through a federal jobs program. And we must prioritize rural and urban areas that have been hit hard by deindustrialization prior to COVID and climate disasters and economic crisis. We must invest in our people, in our society, in healthcare and sanitation and infrastructure and housing and water and public transit and utilities. And we must ensure that this expanded infrastructure is publicly held for the common good rather than corporate and private profit. We must enact meaningful immigration reform and demilitarize immigration and border enforcement and repeal mandatory detention and deportation and child detention and family separation and reunite families and ensure that our immigrant brothers and sisters are eligible for all public welfare and social programs. We must ensure the right and the health of indigenous people on their sacred land, fully fund and expand in Indian health services and tribal schools. And we must repeal the 2017 unnecessary greedy tax law. And we must redirect some money from the bloated military budget to help implement these priorities, safety net programs. And what we must also know is that moral policies are sound economic policies. Just policies are sound economic policies. There are real costs to maintaining this vastly unequal economy. Our studies show that we lose $1 trillion to child poverty costs, and 2.6 trillion is lost earnings from gender and racial wage gaps. We've lost 1.3 trillion in government revenue by lowering corporate tax in 2017. And we've lost 6.4 trillion in endless wars. Inaction in climate change has cost nearly 3.3 trillion annually. 250,000 people were dying from poverty and low wealth even before COVID, a year, 700 a day. And some studies say the cumulative financial costs of the pandemic are estimated to be $16 trillion. Absent radical policy change, there's a very good chance that these unnecessary losses will continue and inequality and equity will worsen. But in the face of these realities, what troubles me, in the face of the need for fundamental change, a strange chorus is heard even out of the mouth of some Black officials and some politicians and some Democrats. They want to claim that people voted for normalizing political relationships and a more genteel political game. We must resist this. We do not need normal. We do not need genteel politics which cover up gross inequity. We need respect, yes, but respect on the outside for the cameras while we have fundamental disrespect and deliberate policy oppression behind the scene is not what we need. Wendell Garrison has connections to this paper called The Nation. His daddy, William Lloyd Garrison, had the Liberator. And I love what he said about those who want to be moderate in the time of need when we need to have conviction. He said, I'm aware, and William Lloyd Garrison said, I'm aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not a cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or to speak or write with moderation. No. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately recuse his wife from the hands of a ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her baby from a fire in which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. This is how William Lloyd Garrison was talking in the abolition movement. And this is how we must be now in the midst of a pandemic of economic proportions and health proportions and the economic of continued systemic racism. We need that conviction, not to be gradual, but to be committed. There were some who were praying for a political change in the presidency. And now that there's a change, they're saying, we just need peace. We just need healing. We just need to move to the center. We've got to get back to normal. And my question and our question in the movement is, really? We need to get back to when we all just got along, they say. Well, when was that? When did that ever happen in America? Democracy has always been a battle and a fight for its soul. Then they say, we need to get back to compromise and have peace. That's the conversation some want to have. But this is why we can't heal. They want folks to get in back rooms and slap backs and make us feel good by giving the perception of peace. But Jesus said that's like how saying peace where there is no peace. You cannot heal a sickness if you compromise with the sickness. Some things can't be compromised. Yes, we can have rational conversations, but some things can't be compromised. That's what has gotten America in trouble in the first place. We compromise with Black people's humanity and called it 3/5. We compromise with slavery. We compromise too much. And even in the church, too many then said it was okay. We compromised and early on and said women didn't have the right to vote. We compromised and said men who didn't have land didn't have the right to vote. Now, did you know that in 1935, for instance, Roosevelt was trying to pass the Social Security Act, but in order to get it passed, they compromised with some folk who said, we'll only go along with it if you make sure women and Black and brown people can't really pay into the system. So the compromise was if you were in the agrarian culture or the domestic culture, you couldn't pay in. 50% of white women were left out, most Black people and brown people. That's what a compromise, a wrong compromise, immoral compromising can do. And how really do you compromise with persons who have literally committed crimes against nature and use their power to hurt so many? How can you compromise with attitudes and actions that cause tens of thousands of people to die from COVID that did not have to? How can you compromise? The truth of the matter is, if Democrats who now have the House and the presidency reveal that compromise is their way of governing, before they put before the country a comprehensive vision that they're willing to fight for, they are going to lose the people who voted for them, and they may never get them back. 55% of the people who voted for Democrats this time were poor and low wealth, and they voted believing that somebody was going to stand up and fight for their lives. We contacted more than 2 million people, and they said they were voting this time. Some said, I'm doing it this time, may not next, because I'm believing that there's still somebody who wants to deal with the pain at the center of our lives. How can you compromise with folks whose mentality is they lost 666 Mexican children stolen from their families, and they shrug it off like it's nothing? How do you compromise with people who are more interested in putting one woman in a Supreme Court seat than keeping thousands of people out of caskets? This is not the time for America for peaceful negligence, but for what Jesus called the sword of love and truth if we want real healing. You know, I come from the country, and sometimes we would develop a boil on our skin. And my grandmother, who never finished but the 4th grade, she would say, come here and let me lance it. And what she meant was to cut the boil open, squeeze all the pus out, and clean it from the inside. She said, you don't put a Band-Aid over things like that because it will only fester and get worse. She knew that real healing requires that we deal with real problems. And so maybe this is the time to, right now, in the midst of COVID, when so many people can hear because the pain has our ears open and our eyes wide open, maybe this is the time to expose and the lies and the myths that have kept America from addressing the needs of poor and sick and the least of these. Maybe a vision needs to be put before the political leaders and give the people a chance to stand up, the same people who were willing to risk their lives to vote. Maybe we need to expose the lie that we don't have the money and show where the money is to lift the people and have health care and living wages and well-funded public education. Maybe we need to tell folks, it's here, it's already here. You don't have to raise taxes. You just stop the unnecessary tax cuts and deal with the bloated military budgets. Maybe it's time for the sword of truth and love to expose how much of the money went in the CARES Act went to banks and corporations rather than building up communities. Maybe it's time for the sword of truth and love to separate us from the lie that health care should only be connected to your job and not your body, and that we need it for all people, and that $15 an hour in health care is not the lie that says that's socialism. It's not socialism. It's social justice. It's injustice for nearly 100 million people to be without health care and 62 million people to work every day for less than a living wage. It's social justice to change that reality. Maybe it's time not to compromise with those who have to work and fight so hard for justice, but it's time to expose that the same persons that cry, it's time to expose the same person that cry socialism today. They call Social Security socialism. They call labor rights socialism. They call the union movement socialism. They call the gains of the civil rights movement socialism. They call Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer socialism. It's not new. It's just old trick language. And maybe we need to resist the language, left, right, center, socialism, and just do what is right. These same people would say that about Jesus, who said we have to feed the hungry and care for the least of these. Maybe it's time to stop compromising with these attitudes and expose them with a vision of love and hope so that people can see the truth, so that some of them will repent and join us. And so together we can experience real unity and healing in this nation, in our churches, and in our communities. If you love justice, you can't be at peace with injustice. If you love good, you can't be at peace with bad. If you love truth, you can't be at peace with lies. If you love mercy, you can't be at peace with meanness. If you love and respect all people, you can't be at peace with racism and xenophobia and homophobia. If you love God, you can't be at peace with false gods and materialism and their lies. And my brothers and sisters, we can do this. I know that some look at the election and Maybe you didn't get everything, but for a moment, let's step back and look again at this election. And 80 million people turned out. And there's still 88 more million people that we can go after that didn't vote. 80 million people. And they voted for a white man and a black woman of Asian Indian descent who ran openly talking about 15 and a union and expanding health care and dealing with systemic racism. Now, I understand it wasn't everything, but that's new. And we should use that as an opportunity, just like the civil rights movement did in '64 when they elected Lyndon Baines Johnson and then they pushed Lyndon Baines Johnson to do the right things. Think about what happened. In our movement alone, we contacted over 3 million people. 6 million more people, poor and low wealth people, voted this time than voted in 2016. 6 million more. That still means we have 28 million who didn't, but 6 million more did vote. If we push the right agenda, the rest of them will come. They will come when they see a politics that deals with what's at the center of their life. 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden Harris. Poor and low wealth people didn't vote for extremism, white or black. No, they voted for change. They voted for something different, 55%. And we can expand that if an agenda comes forward that calls them. We did a study that showed that there are 15 states right now where poor and low wealth people vote between 1% and 19% higher than they did in 2016. They can change every election from the Senate to the presidency. Three reasons why they said they have not voted. Number one, they never hear politicians call their name, poor and low wealth and condition. Transportation, they can't get off their job, and voter suppression. Those are things we can change. A movement can change it. It doesn't have to exist. And I try to believe that even in a strange way, this craziness that Trump is going through and that the senators are engaged in by this delay is actually it's meant for evil, but it's going to work good because it's showing people that this is not just about Trump. It's about a position and a plot that was put in place long ago. Positive polarization by Kevin Phillips and Richard Nixon and Pat Buchanan and Howard Dent and others. And that Trump really benefited from an audience that's been prepared for more than 50 years. But the election had just happened and he lost and he said, okay, some people might have thought it's just about one person. Now he's gone, we can rest. But his continual acting up is activating us and reminding us that we cannot rest. We cannot stop. That it's not just about one person. It is about dealing with this entire hijacking of the political system and intentionally using division and polarization to divide the country for political expedience, to give power to those that will give more power to corporations. Dr. King said it in 1965 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. We must know it today and understand that even in this bad that's happening right now, there's some good because people are coming to see we are in a real battle. And you cannot heal the soul of the nation without healing the body of the nation and the situations that people are experiencing every day. Then look at this election, how there were victories in the West and in the Midwest and in the Northeast and in the South and in the South. Even where we lost in the South, the losing was so much closer than it's ever been for years, which is proof that there's a shifting demographic. There's an opportunity to organize poor and low wealth, black and white and brown and indigenous people, even in the South. And we do this, we can shift the political architecture of this nation and then shift policies. This is movement time. It's not quitting time. We must stay engaged. That's why Monday, we're having Moral Monday, a remembrance of all those who have died, calling for just COVID release and calling for smooth transition and a moral agenda going forward. And we're challenging the new president and vice president-elect, put a moral agenda before the people. The people perish for a lack of knowledge. Where there is no vision, the people perish. But where there's vision, people will stand up, they will move, they will gladly help you and stand strong against the forces of injustice. So we're restarting Moral Mondays nationally. First 100 days, we're going to be there. We're not going anywhere. And we're doing it this Monday in the name of those who have died, because as I close, here's the challenge before us. Our living must honor their dying. Those who have died needlessly. We cannot just go home. We cannot give up on this democracy and making it a more genuine democracy. No, you can't have this many people die and we just walk away from it. No, their dying must increase our living for love, our living for justice, our fighting for what's right. As Martin Luther King said on the last night he was with us, some people remember him saying, I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over. But before he ever said that, he said to the people in that room, considering all of the sacrifices that people had made, he said nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And that is a watchword to us. We cannot heal the soul of this nation without healing the body and the bodies of the people. We have to move by faith. We are not of those, as the scriptures say, who shrink back unto destruction. We are those who press forward to the salvation of the soul. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Our living now, Katrina, our living now, those of you who are in the audience of the nation, we must live now even the more for what we believe, because folk have died and we must ensure that their dying is not in vain. Cannot let this many people have died needlessly and suffered needlessly, and we not make sure that we change things so that this never happens again. It happened in 1919 with Woodrow Wilson. We've seen it before, but we are the generation, but must make sure it never happens again. We must, while we're living, we have to now fight for living wages. We have to fight for poor and low wealth people. We have to push for health care for all. We have to push to take resources from our bloated military budget and use it for education and infrastructure and health care and education. We have to live now for all those who died that did not have to die and should not have died. Those who suffered the crimes against humanity in these modern times in these United States, their memory and their spirit is calling on us to fight on, and to not give up. And so I'm reminded of that song that used to be sung in the movement. It was first sung in a place on Broadway. And it simply says, go out and tell the story. Let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. Make them hear you how justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we choose to fight that sometimes there are battles that are more than black and white. And I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you. Go out and tell the story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And tell them in our struggles, we were not the only ones. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. Your sword could be a sermon or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice. And then, my brothers and sisters, then will justice be demanded by 10,000 righteous men and women. Make them hear you. That is what we must do in the times and in the days ahead. God bless you. And thank you so much.
Hi, Reverend Barber. That was extraordinary, and our community is hearing you. The chat is full of expressions of gratitude and lots of questions, and so I would like to surface them up for our community. John asks if you could share what you found to be most hopeful about our recent election results, and also what you found to be most concerning.
What I found to be one of the things most hopeful is I live in the South, and I can remember the days clearly. Hold on, let me take a seat. I can remember the days clearly when there was not even a consideration about African Americans running for the Senate or the House and being competitive. And this last election, we've seen 3 African-American men, one in Mississippi that came within a couple of points, one in South Carolina, in the former home of Strom Thurmond, and now in Georgia. We see an African-American and a Jewish brother who are running in Georgia. I mean, if you just know that history 50, 60 years ago, that's amazing. Or just a few years ago, it was unheard of. It was unheard of. And to think all of the voter suppression that has been illegally done in those states, to see this happening is encouraging. The fact that 55% of poor and low-wealth people, because we've had this false narrative that poor and low-wealth people making less than $50,000 a year were the supporters of Trump. They weren't the supporters in 2016, nor the supporters in 2020. 55% of poor and low-wealth people did not vote for Trumpism. That we need to hear that and understand that we can expand this electorate because there's 64 million poor and low-wealth people. 29 million voted the last election. They think about 35 million voted this time, but that means we still have about 24 million, about 28 million people, poor and low wealth, that can still be moved. And that's encouraging. Our report is encouraging. What is discouraging is the way this conversation is going about voter fraud and suppression, because the extremists are claiming others have done to them what we know they do. They've been proven in court as so you can't make phrase like there's no voter suppression. There is. It's just not directed at Trump and his crowd. It's directed at Black people and brown people, indigenous people and poor white people. And it's upheld by people like McConnell, because for over 2,700 days, 7 years since 2013, he's refused to even allow the Voting Rights Act to be discussed, to expand voting rights. You know, that's like 2,600 some odd days longer than Strom Thurmond filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act. That's racism. That's racism. That's straight up racism. And then the last thing that has disappointed me is to see some Democrats and others, I don't care if they're Black or white or who they are, they haven't even finalized the election yet, and they already started turning and talking about center and being moderate, and rather than a vision. Nobody really knows what those terms mean, left and right. I mean, they're just terms people use as talking points. People try to identify people that sometimes the language is too puny for this moment. It doesn't even fit. We're in the middle of major pandemics. What should happen instead, and I'm pushing and praying with others, and we're demanding, put a vision before the people. A vision. I said to Vice President-elect Biden, President-elect Biden, in Easter, the hope is in the morning, MOURNING. He said, what do you mean? I said, the hope is, people are hurting and mourning. If you want folk to have hope, answer their mourning, answer their pain, speak to what's calling, talk about the policies that are going to change their mourning to rejoicing, their misery to hope, and their misery to uplift. And then that's where hope comes. Hope is not something you just talk about and casually. It has to be practical. It has to be about addressing despair. And so my hope that, I don't care if it's Clyburn or anybody or the congressperson out of Virginia, stop saying what can't be done. We can't win if we talk about this and suggesting that things are socialism or everything we hold dear today. 100 years ago, people said it couldn't be done. They said it couldn't be done. Don't say what can't be done. Put a vision before the people and put a face on the vision. Show how it's going to help people in every area, in every state, red or blue, southern or northern, and then put it forward and then fight for it. Don't compromise before you've even fought. That makes no sense at all.
What do you think that the Biden administration is going to fight for in the first 100 days, and how can we push them for the things that we need?
Well, we've asked to sit with them because our campaign, as I said, touched over 3 million people. And in June 20th of this past year, we had over 2.7 million people to come for the Mass Poor People's Assembly. We would have had that in DC, and we're going to have a mass gathering as soon as COVID is over. I hope put 500,000 or more people in the street. But we have to do that because we got to put a face on poverty and the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of healthcare, the war economy, and this false moral narrative, religious nationalism. Biden spoke before our group of about 1.3 million people on September 14th. We invited Trump. Trump didn't come. Biden said that he said on camera that his theory of change was ending poverty. We want to hold him to that. I still get concerned when Democrats can't seem to say poverty and low wealth. I don't know what. I was told by Pete Buttigieg in an open forum that the consultants actually tell them don't use the word poverty. It's so ridiculous. They say people will get offended. People aren't offended when you say they're poor if you're going to try to do something about it. They only offended if you call them poor as a way of putting people down, or if you try to blame them for their poverty or racialize their poverty. But folk are actually concerned that nobody talks about their real life condition. They're not in the middle class. They're not in the upper class. And we already know, as Pope Francis said, that the magical formulas of trickle down and neoliberalism from the middle class up, they don't work. So what I pray and hope that first of all, they will be true to the first 3 things as a minimum of what they ran on, that they will immediately recognize that they've got to have COVID reached through the first 4 things. And that COVID release, he has said we got to pay and protect essential workers. That needs to become a policy. Don't be compromising on it before you put it on the floor. It needs to come as a full policy from the House. Hopefully there'll be a new Senate. If there's not, you still put it forward and give the people a chance to push for it. And then he said 15 in a union. That's got to become a reality. And it can't be 5 years from now, because actually the concept of 15 in the union started in 1963 at the March on Washington, when they wanted $2 minimum wage, which today would be 15. We need expanded health care. They ran on that. It has to happen. And they said they were going to deal with systemic racism. And that means, yes, police brutality, but it must mean more than that. It must mean dealing with the racism that comes when you defund public education, when you cut community centers. It means helping the indigenous community where this virus has just gone crazy on lands. It means protecting their federal lands. It means stopping all of the hatred and the mean policies toward our Latino brothers and sisters and other immigrants. And it means addressing up front, we need to have a restoration of the Voting Rights Act and expansion of voting now, because what this election has shown, and by the way, to go back, another sign of hope is 80-some million people. And we proved in this election, if people have an opportunity to vote, not just a day, but an opportunity to vote, they will vote.
Thank you. Steve Neames wonders what you make of evangelical support of Trump and Trumpism. And if I could add to that, are you able to build coalitions within the evangelical community? And what does that look like?
Well, you see, because I don't follow the language that we've been handed, wouldn't answer that question that way, because that's not evangelicalism. That's some people that's like a frog deciding to call me a turtle, but he's not a turtle, he's a frog. So when somebody tells you that their religion tells them to hate people who are gay, be against women, be for tax cuts for the wealthy, be for guns and act like Jesus isn't a founding member of the NRA, not say anything about healthcare, not say anything about living with, that's not evangelicalism, biblical evangelicalism. That's a group of people who've decided to take a term and hope that nobody will ever expose them. That kind of evangelicalism is kind of like slave master religion. It's the religion of the spiritual mobilization that corporations founded in the 1935 to stand against the New Deal. Kevin Cruz wrote a book on that called The Purchasing of the American Pulpit. He's a Princeton scholar. That kind of religion is the religion that stood against Dr. King and against the civil rights movement. So that's not even, I'm an evangelical, so I can't call that evangelicalism, because biblical evangelicalism starts with good news to the poor, the patokos in Greek, those who've been made poor because of economic exploitation. Biblical evangelicalism talks about healing people, the brokenhearted, lifting the oppressed, setting people free, welcoming all people. So what you have is we've had years of hijacking the term. but not the tenacity or the true theories and the true foundations and the true morality of evangelicalism. Having said that, they've been very good at it because they got a lot of funds, and most of them are really funded by corporate. They have a lot of corporate money, because if you notice, evangelicals, this is the trick that they've run on a lot of people. They tell people to vote for people because of social, cultural issues like being against gay people and gay. They're not going to overturn Roe. They just, white women, Republicans aren't even going to allow that. I mean, they're not going to go back. Have they been able to go back on gay rights? No, they've gone forward. But what do the people they vote for, if you check their records, what do they always get? 95% of their votes go toward corporations. So what you got is an unholy alliance with money and a false form of religion. But it calls itself evangelicalism, but it's not according to biblical standards. So can we build alliances? Sure. There's a whole group of folk now that have left so-called white evangelicalism. They call themselves red letter Christians now. We're working with them. My best friend and brother in the movement, Jonathan Hartgrove, grew up in white evangelicalism, trained by Strom Thurmond. He's now written a book called, I can't remember the exact title, but basically it's how to set yourself free from slaveholder religion. And he traces the so-called white evangelicalism all the way back to slaveholder religion. Your readers ought to get it. We've written books together, Revive Us Again, Preaching in the Public Square. Yes, by teaching the gospel, teaching the true isms of faith in both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, New Testament. Yes, we can not only reach folk, we are reaching people, and we are slowly getting the media to re-identify evangelicalism and stop just using the term because somebody gave it to you. You know, it's kind of like the left-right. Who told people that believe in healthcare for all, you're on the left, and people that don't, you're on the right? How do you call somebody right and then try to convince people they're wrong? I mean, we picked up all this language that doesn't help us, which is why one of the things I'm fighting for is narrative shift. If we're going to use language, use the language that people swore to uphold. Make them answer that language. How does this policy establish justice? I don't want to hear about left or right. You swore to do this. How does this policy provide for the common defense? How does it promote the general welfare? How does this policy ensure domestic tranquility? How does this policy provide equal protection under law for all people? Don't talk to me about these other terms that you never swore to uphold. You didn't swear to uphold these, but you did swear to uphold these terms. And that's the conversation we got to force.
Over the past few days of our festival, there's been a lot of conversation about the damage done to institutions, to norms, to processes, and the long road back to recover. And Carol Bolin Abrahamson asks specifically if you have thoughts about the census. Can we audit it and can we correct it, since that's a foundation of a lot of policy?
I think in the first few days, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who passed 70 some pieces of policy in the first 100 days, you know, that's where we get this notion of the first 100 days of a presidency. It was during the Great Depression and then the Roosevelt era. I think the Biden-Harris team has got to put a stack of executive orders on their desk the first week and just undo stuff. I mean, you know, what we have seen over the past few years is meanness, narcissism, racism, and in some ways, forms of policy evil, just use power abruptly and abrasively and without any concern and aggressively, right? Aggressively. We now need to see good do the same thing. We now need to see aggressive good. We now need to see good that doesn't say wait and slow down. And you can't wait on the people to come around, especially if you get the power. You can't wait on people to come around who've already proven they don't want to come around. They only want to slow you down and stop you. And that's one of the things Democrats are going to have to make a decision on. We're going to have to push them on that, which is why in the Poor People's Campaign, we are, nonpartisan. We got to push them and say, one of the things that allowed for Trumpism and will always allow for Trumpism is when people are left hurting, they remain open to demagogues. And there were so many times when Democrats had the House and the Senate and the presidency, and they didn't do all they need to do. I'm struck sometimes by there's this guy that comes on MSNBC and CNN, Kasich, right? John Kasich of Ohio. Now he's all against Trumpism. I want to do an interview with him and say, but you helped set up Trumpism because you were the one that did all the welfare reform and cut money from people. That ain't nothing but Trumpism. It's just, you just didn't do it as nasty and as to the extreme. We got a lot of Republicans that are coming around that need to repent and need to recognize that Trumpism is only the outgrowth of a plot and a plan and policies pushed by people who hijacked the Republican Party for the last 52 years. So, which is also why finally I heard your question and say, how do we get back? I don't know if getting back is the exact way we need to move. You know, the Fed chief just came out yesterday and said, we are not going to get the economy back that we once had. And I don't know if we want that back, because that normal was 140 million people poor and low wealth, 43% of the nation. That back was 700 people dying a day from poverty. That was 4 million people getting up every morning with buy unleaded gas, came by unleaded water. So I don't know if that, I understand what people are trying to say. We at least need to stop what's happening now, but maybe what we really need is to stop and go forward. Maybe it's actually forward together. It's kind of like amending the Constitution. There's not one amendment in the Constitution that went backwards. There's not one. Every amendment of the Constitution expanded the democracy. It went for, there may be one, but it was, I forget what it was, but it may have been on something like prohibition or something like that. I'm not sure. But for the most part, every amendment of the Constitution went forward. So we got to be careful, progressives, revolutionaries, radicals, all of whatever you call yourself. We got to be careful the language we use, right? Because we kind of want pre-Trump days, but if you get the pre-Trump days, you still got a whole lot of poverty days. You still have McConnell days. You still have Boehner days. You still have Nixon days. I mean, where is this great place behind us? What we need is vision, and vision is about forward. Vision is about forward. The back we need to do is look back to see where we were that we don't want to be anymore. Like the Sankofa bird out of Africa. You look backwards, but you fly forward, right? You look backwards, but you fly forward. Or as my daddy used to say, when you drive a car, you glance in the rearview mirror. You don't drive looking in the rearview mirror because you're going to have a wreck. You glance in the rearview mirror to see where you've come from, but your purpose is forward. So we need to have, and what we've done in the Poor People's Campaign, I hope your listeners will go there, is we've put forward a forward vision called the Poverty, Moral Justice Jubilee budget and agenda. It looks forward. It shows what kind of money we will have if we invest, how a moral budget is also a just budget and economically sane, but we've got to look forward. Like the Reconstruction movement in 1868, they looked forward. Like the Civil Rights movement, they looked forward. We've got to look forward, not so much how we go back.
Thank you. If our team hasn't done it yet, we can put a link to the Poor People's Campaign in the chat so people can check it out. Reverend Barber, your point about language is really important because it is powerful. Thank you for that. We're almost out of time. We're out of time. There's so many questions that we can't get to because you're really inspiring and this is extraordinary. So I wonder if you could leave everybody with what is a hopeful thought you have for this time.
You know, I think about that often. And for me, in these days that we have, you know, I've been thinking about the experience that we are all forced to have in this moment. Like, for instance, we're all forced to know a little bit about what it means to be untouchable. So I hope that coming out of this, we will be more willing to touch people. We're all experiencing a little bit more what it means to die. People can die for reasons not their own. They're not called home by the Great Spirit, but they die from policy negligence. And my hope is out of that pain, we will have a eternal dissatisfaction with policies that cause death. And then some of the most hopeful things to me have come from people who have suffered. My dear friend Pamela Rush, who in Alabama was one of the first testifiers in the Poor People's Campaign, she caught COVID. She was supposed to testify in June. She couldn't, but she made sure that we had a tape. And the day that we did June 20th, she was not with us, but her words were there. And I remember standing in her yard in Alabama, even before COVID. She was under so much economic and poverty and racist problems. Her children were sick and couldn't breathe. One of them had a CPAP machine because of all the mold in the house. But she said, I want to be a part of this movement. I want to change things. And if I can get anywhere, I'll go and tell the truth. There's so much power in that, so much hope. And I've seen that in the Apache people of Oak Flats who now are trying to fight for their land. People with so much love, so much truth, so much commitment. I've seen it in the hills of Appalachia and Kentucky. I've seen it I was on the Tenderloin of San Francisco, and a guy on the street just walked up to me and said, hey, Reverend Barber, we with you, we with the fight. I'm like, oh. And so what gives me hope is the people who have every reason to say to hell with this damn country, and to hell with movement, and to hell with trying to stand up. But they refuse to let go, not of optimism. They don't have optimism, they have hope, which is very honest about the despair. And so in this moment, I've thought a lot about what does it mean to be alive when the truth is a germ could take you to death in 48 hours. What does it mean to be alive? I don't care who you are, from a prince to a pauper. If the right germ hits you and your body can't fend it off, you could leave here in 48 hours. What does it mean to be alive? And maybe what it means is that you decide with every breath that I have, I may live 48 minutes, 48 days, 48 years or on, but what I do know is now we have no breath to waste unless we're using that breath to breathe love, truth, hope, and transformation into this society. And so my hope is getting up in the morning, remembering those who have died, committing to live my life in remembrance of them so that my own living, our living is not in vain. Being committed with people who are building movement, and knowing that life is so precious that we don't have a moment to waste our breath doing anything but trying to breathe justice. And when I see all these movements, as I close, and I see the writings of the nation, when I see the Sunrise Movement and Poor People's Campaign and Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15 and the Women's March and all of these folk that stood with mask and line, what I see them doing is trying to breathe life into this democracy and refusing the stale air of racism and hatred and injustice, and declaring that we can resuscitate this dying experiment that we've seen on life support in many ways, and we can move forward together with new breath. That's what
Reverend Barber, thank you so much for it's really powerful and extraordinary, and you've given us a lot to reflect on, and I'm grateful. And with that, Katrina Vanden Heuvel is joining.
Reverend Barber, thank you. May people go to the Poor People's Campaign. You have given us vision, you give us breath, you give us a way forward, and you remind us of what true hope is, and that we, the living, must, honor the dying with our work. We won't go back because, as you said, we need to go forward to honor those and to honor the movements you mentioned, the movement you've built, and the voice you give to millions. So thank you with great gratitude. And as you said, this is a movement time, not a quitting time.
That's right.
And compromise, and I will let you go to your other, but the left, right, I love, you are someone who understands what the center is. The center is where people's lives are. Mm-hmm. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and we have a lot of work to do. But you are at the center of that work, so that gives hope. Thank you very much, Reverend, and thank you for being part of the nation and our times.
God bless you. Take care to all. Thank you.
So I want to just open by saying how grateful I am to you for being part of this extraordinary festival. Think about what we've just heard from Reverend Barber. He is someone who understands we need a new political architecture. He understands movements. He understands the power of words. He talked about narrative shift. And I think that's so extraordinary. And he brings what I hope this festival has brought to all of you is a sense of a community, of conscience, of compassion, of a solidarity, and that we at the nation believe in so much Reverend Barber spoke to us about just now. There's no point in compromising without fighting. We are living in times where there are new opportunities and new perils, but we are poised to engage and address. As you could see in this festival of the last few days, the nation has, I think, an extraordinary convening power. Look at the range of topics and speakers you've heard over these last 3.5, 4 days on travel, on sports, on racial justice, women in power, from Iceland with the extraordinary Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir to Oakland with Black Lives Matter's co-founder Alicia Garza, and moved by this unifying spirit, unifying and clarifying, unifying in that all of our speakers, I think, demonstrated a commitment to the values of compassion, of tolerance, of debate, of unflinching analysis. And those connect our community and clarify the work we do, the work we need to get back to. And all of us are engaged in different ways. And I hope this festival gave kind of what the Reverend did for us this afternoon, gave us a jolt to remind us that there is so much work to be done in this great country to fulfill the promise of its founding. We saw the importance of individual dignity. The Reverend, of course, embodies the commitment to dignity of the poor. And by the way, Melissa Harris Perry and Dorian Warren are committing their next 2 podcasts on the eve of Thanksgiving to why are Americans poor? We don't flinch from that word. We understand the moral center is needed to be discussed. But think of the individual dignity that Rick Steves spoke with Sasha Abramsky about, the inherent value of connecting culturally and listening as we travel. Ai-jen Poo of the Domestic Workers Organization and George Gale, one of the great organizers in this country who's pioneered deep canvassing, radical canvassing, clarified the importance of recognizing the often invisible work that makes this country and many of our lives possible. As the Reverend spoke of, in policy terms, the need for essential workers to get relief, to heal in these next weeks. And then there was Naomi Klein, the brilliant Naomi Klein, who had this extraordinary conversation with Tokata and Chase Aronise and gave a voice to the trampled rights and values of the indigenous peoples of North America. Shannon Watts of Moms Demand and Joan Walsh demonstrated in their conversation how to end America's homicidal relationship with guns. I was so struck as I listened to them. News came that there had been another shooting outside of Milwaukee, and to read that expression, active shooter, as Shannon Watts so strategically and humanely laid out how to end this gun violence. What the Nation Festival also shows is we don't just moan, we organize, and there are solutions available if we, struggle and fight and push and organize for. Bernie Sanders. I mean, I think he's changed the trajectory of our politics over these last years, and he spoke very humanely and strategically. And he talked about how people need an explanation as to what's happened to their lives in these last years, which led me the other night in the fireside chat to suggest Joe Biden take 15 minutes a day in this transition, this fraught transition, to hold a fireside chat would be something of value. Robert Reich, someone who's been inside, locked inside the cabinet, but is one of the great economic analysts. And he gave us his good vision, time, suggestions about building coalitions to make progressive left stronger. And then, as I said, the value of internationalism and learning from the world, which is what the nation has done for decades, shown through with John Nichols' interview at the very beginning of the festival with Iceland's Prime Minister Karen Jakobsdóttir. And I thought it was a beautiful kickoff. She spoke so powerfully about what it means to be a feminist in power, as well as very humanly about her return someday to writing crime fiction, detective crime fiction. I was struck with the Reverend Barber. He spoke so often of the power of words, the narrative shift he's engaged with. Novelist Walter Mosley gave us a first reading of his new novel, but also reminded us of the power of words to shape our reality, and reminded us that great cultural figures, Toni Morrison, for example, Tony Kushner, have been part of the nation's community over decades. The nation has been concerned with the Supreme Court for decades, and I thought the second day panel on the current state of the Supreme Court, on the courts with Randall Kennedy, Representative Jamie Raskin discovering Randall Kennedy had been Jamie's professor at law school, but with Nan Aaron, Elie Mystal, our justice correspondent, and John Nichols moderating, was a terrific, really superb court panel. And then, of course, Melissa Harris Perry and Dorian Warren you heard from today. And I think that podcast is going to be a great, great part of the political cultural spectrum. And we're proud to be hosting it at the Nation. Remarkable correspondents: John Nichols, Joan Walsh, Elie Mystal, Sasha Abramsky, Jeet here, Mark Hertzgaard, Dave Zirin. What an interview, talking about a sports editor at a publication. I mean, that, and then Melissa and Dorian. And, we can't do this without you. To pull together a publication, a website reaching 18-year-olds to 100-year-olds, bringing history to bear, ensuring that we're part of this moment, oxygenating, sustaining the movements Reverend Barber and others spoke of. Also, never losing sight of the need to go forward, not compromising, as William Lloyd Garrison, as Reverend Barber reminded us, onward, do not retreat. And our call has been that, to commit, not to gradualism, but to what could be. So I also wanted to thank Bud Trillin, Calvin Trillin, who's been a great part of the Nation for many years. I wanted to thank the very important discussion of rural broadband. Bill McKibben came to us many months ago in a parking lot because he couldn't access broadband. Zephyr Teachout is in Vermont, can't access, and Ro Khanna, a leader, as is Pramila, very much so in the House. Both have committed to that issue, and many others. So you heard from some of the sort of powerhouses emerging. I want to close thanking Aaron O'Mara, the nation's president, Peter Rothberg, who's been a great team member of the Nation for many, many years, Sarah Burke, who spent so much time, as did the others, and Gia Leprado. And the team at Really Useful Media, Paul Gale, Dan Winkler, and Josh Simon, who kept us on the right road. It was brilliant technically. Thank you. And I want to just say again to you who are been part of this festival, can't do it without you. I know you've already, come in for the ticket, and I hope the festival met all of your dreams. I thought it was extraordinary, and I've been with the Nation for many, many, many years, but this was the first ever virtual, and it reminds us of how you can bring people from many parts. They give you their all. I think every Zoom session had its extraordinary moments. And so I hope you'll consider taking out subscriptions, even for your crazy uncle, but contributing in ways you can, telling people about the Nation, telling people about this festival, which we are going to put some behind we're going to be using much of the material, the content, which we think is priceless, to fill our website and in other ways. So I want to thank you again for spending these last days with us. I think it's been a really extraordinary festival, and it has brought joy and lessons. And to close with the Reverend, I will say one thing. I was at an event with the Reverend once. The nation was receiving an award. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was supposed to receive the final award. No one wanted to follow the Reverend. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg agreed to go in the middle of the ceremony. Reverend Barber brought down the church, the house. So to follow Reverend Barber is both an inspiration and very difficult. But thank you for being part of this festival. Okay. Good afternoon, wherever you are.